So, I'm writing a novel. Is the show where you join me, Oliver Brackenbury, on the journey of writing my next novel, from first ideas all the way to publication and promotion. In this one man reality show, I'll share with you my ever evolving thoughts and feelings on how I write, being a writer, and everything that entails at each stage of the process. I'll also answer listener questions and, sometimes, interview people who write fiction. If you're the kind of person who likes to learn how things are made and get to know the people making them, then this is the show for you. Just this past weekend, I took a half day heroic fantasy writing course. Heroic fantasy is kind of an umbrella term for genres like sword and sorcery or the sword and planet stuff I talked about with you last time. Today, I'll be interviewing the teacher of that course, an author named Howard Andrew Jones. Howard primarily writes beneath the heroic fantasy umbrella, and boy does he know his sword and sorcery. My first encounter with his work was when I picked up an issue of the excellent Sword and Sorcery magazine he oversees as the editor, Tales from the Magician's Skull. Others might know him from his Pathfinder novels, his Sword and Sandal series following the adventures of Dabir and Asim, his scholarship of arguably the greatest influence on Robert E. Howard's writing style, historical adventure author Harold Lamb, or perhaps you're one of the many people excited for the just-released grand finale of his epic fantasy Ring Sworn trilogy, When the Goddess Wakes. Well, the publisher calls it epic fantasy, but I have good reason to believe it's really sword and sorcery wearing a fancy disguise. I'll ask Howard about that in this very interview. Hey, maybe I should just cut to that, huh? Alright, let's go. And here I am with Howard Andrew Jones. Hello, Howard.
Hello, Oliver. It's nice to be here.
Yeah, it's good to see you. I guess I only saw you a few days ago at the Heroic Fantasy writing class, which I rather enjoyed.
Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it. I had a lot of fun with that myself.
Yeah, and I've got lots of notes to go through, and I've actually got a question about that, but one thing at a time. I have so much I want to ask you. I'm very excited for this. I spent a lot of time on these questions today. I've kind of got that eager student in class situation going on here, so we'll see how that goes. First up, I actually took a bunch of notes before that writing class, all the way last year in October when you were on some panels at the Bride of Cyclops Con that Goodman Games ran. And I just got some stuff here I was curious to follow up on with you. For example, in Behind the Scenes with Publishers of Heroic Fiction, that panel, you brought up the importance of reading outside your sort of main genre and taking what you can, using the example of how you read a bunch of westerns you might not normally have been drawn to, and then were able to write much more convincing like horses and horse related scenes, in your own work. I'm wondering, it's been a minute, that was last October. Since then, have you picked up any other useful tools from reading outside your usual genres?
Well, absolutely. Although I've continued to read in the same outside genres that I've been doing. So, historical fiction, westerns, which is just a specific flavor of historical fiction, really, and hard-boiled detective fiction. And I continue to take great pleasure in finding these older books from the 50s that are so lean and mean and propulsive. So much is conveyed about backstory over the course of the story rather than front loading it at the beginning, which seems to be favored by a lot of modern fantasy writers. You provide a whole bunch of backstory up front, and then, to me, how can I say this? Well, there's nothing wrong with that. I prefer the action to get moving right away, to get hooked inside, and I like to see if you're going to have a complex backstory, have it come out naturally rather than just have it dropped into the reader's lap. And then the reader's supposed to say, oh, well, this is just the part where I learned the info dump. I guess that's okay. Well, actually, older writers knew how to do that skillfully and work it into their narrative and have it actually be part of the mystery that helps pull you forward.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of that too. That's definitely a big part of what's really gotten me into sword and sorcery. And now I'm sort of edging into historical fiction. I started reading Harold Lamb. I picked up the first volume of that series that you worked on. I think there's nothing. I mean, people can like what they like, but I share something you mentioned at one point, which is a kind of impatience almost. I want to get into it. Let's get into that story. Okay, so in that same panel, you said given your options, because I mean, there's what you want to do and there's what publishers want to put out, right? But given your options, you would prefer to maybe write books more around the 50,000 to 60,000 word length, less so the kind of 100, 120, 150, sort of longer phone books that are more maybe in fashion and with contemporary fantasy. I'm just curious. Again, this was last October. Have you got any plans for something that length, and or both in the sense of the story you would tell and how you would get out into the world?
Well, yes and no. I mean, it's interesting to me. I felt like a 140,000, 150,000 word book felt long to me. And it took me a while to figure out how to write one that was longer than 90,000. And because I didn't want it to feel padded, I want to keep the pacing but make it a longer book. And so it took me a little bit of extra time to figure out how to keep up that pacing. But anyway, so when I did write a couple of, actually three now, 120 to 140,000 word novels, there's some people that said that, well, these are very short novels for modern fantasy. So I, I don't know what I'm supposed to do with that because
How do you win?
yeah, I'm not really interested in writing too much longer than this. It would take me years to finish anything. That said, I am working on a secret project, and I think it is going to be longer, but I'm using some sneaky techniques to get it that way without padding. I'm really having an awful lot of fun with it.
Well, I'll be curious to see what that is because I think it's an interesting challenge. I mean, if you keep up the pace of like a really tight 5,000 word short story over the course of 120,000 or more words, it can almost be exhausting. I think about, I guess I'm going to movies. Did you see the film Uncut Gems with Adam Sandler?
I have not actually. I haven't been watching as much media lately.
Oh, fair enough. Well, the reason I mention it is just because you don't even need to know the story. It's just a sort of infamous for being like an anxiety attack in movie form. What an endorsement, right? But but it's that thing of where every single scene it feels almost as intense as like the showdown at the end of the third act of most other movies, and it's kind of exhilarating until you get to about three quarters of, for me anyway, three quarters of the way through the movie, and you're just like, oh my god, my adrenaline gland is completely empty. I guess I'm thinking about that in terms of let's just say maintaining the sort of quick pounding pace over the course of a longer novel, and like that wouldn't be a challenge, right? It's almost exhausting the reader having to find a rhythm where you can get like at least a bit of a lull here and there. I don't know. What do you think?
It definitely is. I think the problem with a lot of the very large novels is that they do feel padded. They do seem strung out, and they seem. I guess Wheel of Time is one of the famous examples
Mm-hmm.
where some people feel that by the time you get to the fourth or fifth book, it's just being drawn out deliberately to make it longer rather than to actually maintain momentum. If a story can't be told in short enough space, one wonders why some of it wasn't left on the editing room floor. But some people really do want to immerse themselves. I prefer, well, so for instance, I know that you're working on a serial novel.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also working on the Secret Project is a serial novel, and my sense is that while for a long time I would have thought that that would not have had much appeal, I think today people are used to the concept. I'm hoping that publishers won't be as closed to the notion anymore. They're used to it because they're seeing episodic TV where each episode builds off the one before and then it reaches a season climax. And we've also seen recent publishing successes like The Witcher. Now, the Witcher, of course, has that game base behind it, which helped. But let's not forget that the first two Witcher collections are collections of short stories. And Sword and Sorcery does lend itself to the short structure because that's where it came from. And if you're going to duplicate and aim for that feel of that, grab you from the front and keep you moving, short stories that are arranged in episodic fashion are definitely a good way to go.
Yeah, and it's so enticing to try and like with my I'll only speak for myself here, but maybe you'll sympathize. It is as someone who's come in well after the golden age and the Renaissance and the Silver Age and even the boom and bust of the '80s and so on of sword and sorcery has all happened. To look back and read through either people who planned out their short stories as one big saga or strung them together, usually like I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly. It's a 50-50 chance. Liber?
That's right.
Oh,
He
thank God.
didn't like it to be. He did not like it when people pronounced it wrong and said Bieber.
So okay, Library, yes, but yes, like Fritz Leiber with the Fafhrd and Grey Monster novels, or how Howard did not plan it that way, but there was the infamous Lancer paperback series from the 60s and 70s.
But he meant it to sound more like people sitting down and hearing an occasional story from the life of Conan. Whatever he felt like, sort of like whatever the storyteller around the fire felt like telling at the time. Maybe it's a story from his young days as a thief. Maybe it's a days from when he was king. I think the only one of those foundational writers who deliberately wrote everything sort of planned out and in sequence would be Vance, because Liebert sort of skipped around and imposed chronology later. I believe Michael Moorcock, of course, he comes later than some of the other foundational ones, but I believe even he continued to sort of mess with the chronology of Elric, whereas the Cudgel, the clever stories, were written in order, in sequence, and then collected. I know the second one was written in some of the short stories were published separately, and then they were collected. Can't recall if the first one was handled the same way, but it's an episodic serial novel that functions perfectly well as a novel because it builds towards something.
Yeah, no, I remember when I got to the end of the second part of that Cugel saga, right, the third book of the Dark Dying Earth series, and it was so neat because you could pull any of those short stories out and enjoy them. Just, oh, he's a scoundrel, you get it pretty quickly. I know he's a scoundrel in a possibly old weird world, and yet reading them in sequence was very rewarding. I was mostly laughing all the way through that because it is a very funny series. But when it got to the end, near the end, those last 7 pages, I felt so tense, so incredibly tense. And I would never have felt that way if I hadn't been reading the whole thing in sequence. So I kind of love that because to me it's having the best of both worlds. And that's what I'm hoping for with my serialized novel, where, yeah, you can just, you can dive in like a box of chocolates and pick out any given story and have a good time, but you are rewarded. Like, you're not punished if you do that, but you're rewarded if you read it in sequence.
I think it's a wonderfully rewarding exercise because the writer has to make sure, the writer has to play by certain rules that each one can stand alone, but they are more interesting and they build if you read them one after the other. Of course, you have to do things like not repeat the same plot elements over and over. You've got to show some character changes. You've got to have some recurring situations. I like some of the Brack stories, but some of the Brack stories tend to repeat themselves. And so something I'm conscious of, okay, I don't want the same kind of monster to keep turning up. Or I don't want them to, if there is a monster, and not to say there's a monster in everything, then they can't defeat it in the same way. An old friend of mine, when he would run Dungeons & Dragons adventures, or actually any kind of role-playing adventure, the villain would inevitably be involved with mind control. I mean, that was the go-to thing. And so I try to be aware as a writer, okay, what's my go-to thing? Let's not go to it again this time, right?
Yeah, I was almost worried because my protagonist in this serialized novel, I already said in the podcast, so why not? She's sort of a big Rosie the Riveter type woman with a warhammer that she'll quite happily club you with. And I had to be very careful to write her personality as being very different from the character in my first novel, which is like a horror novel set in contemporary sort of near future. But it's about a young woman who kind of gets overwhelmed by financial precarity and how there seems to be no consequences for the financial types who caused things like the collapse of 2008. And she puts on a costume and starts murdering them. And so she's going around solving problems with violence. And I'm kind of like, and using even like improvised like weapons she finds on her job at a junkyard. And I'm just thinking, okay, I got to be careful here. Like if I have a story with my sort of sorcery character, and she's like, oh, I really hate these merchants and how they mess around. Right? You can have these like almost like in my case it sounds like a grudge, but you can have these sort of things you can just lean into almost reflexively because they come out of your personal beliefs or your preferences.
As a writer, you have to be careful that you're not constantly hitting the same nail over and over. And I'm sure that you've read writers that you like even who do that. They keep coming back to the same thing over and over. John McDonnell was brilliant, but he was so into preserving Florida, not that there's anything wrong with that, but it kept coming up in every single one of his hard-boiled thrillers. It's like, okay, here's the bit where he gets in a soapbox and complains about environmental degradation. And, you read that enough times, you're like, wow, I wish you could work this in a little bit more smoothly rather than...
Well, funny enough, you mentioned that. It kind of gets me to my next question, where I'm still thinking about those panels. They really stuck with me. If you don't mind, it feels like I'm living in October of last year, but whatever. In the Best of Sword and Sorcery in the 20th Century panel, Bill Ward described the genre as an unsentimental pulp thing. The pace has to move. It's intimate, personal. People feel incredibly significant, not insignificant, in the face of cosmic horror as they face it and come out the other side. Then you agreed and added something that this is really what stuck in my brain. You said, accept the horror, but fight anyway. Accept the horror, but fight anyway. I love that as a way of summing up what Bill was saying, and it feels to me like a very almost empowering slogan, one that could be applied to all kinds of activism wrestling with big, almost like existential world issues as much as Sword and Sorcery's protagonists. Meanwhile, a lot of people, I suspect, assume that the genre is all surface, just about blood and guts, wizards, and chainmail bikinis, right? And how, you're, I imagine, familiar with how in one of his bombastic introductions to the Lancer Conan paperbacks, Lynn Carter advertised a lack of substance as an incentive to read the stories within. Don't have to think about, the whatever, there's all these dated issues like the taxes or, I think he was perhaps missing some of the themes in the original Howard stories. So my question, with the big preamble here, do you think there's room for social issues and commentary in Sword and Sorcery, and is that ever on your mind while creating your own stories?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely, there's room for it. Even if it comes down to the message simply being that we need to inspire bravery to fight the thing in the dark, or to find the strength to save our family or overcome the tribe's dread horror. Sword and Sorcery stories were those things that gave us courage around the campfire. Yes, I definitely think you can have messaging in fiction. I would prefer it not to be again, hit you over the head with the message kind of thing. But yeah, there's all kinds of possible subtlety that can be used, and I do try to employ it. No one yet has accused me of sounding a gong and beating a drum about the little things that I do, but I hope people will see me there. I think it's perfectly possible to do it. I feel badly that Lynn was saying those things back in the day. I have a lot of respect for him as an editor. I do like some of his writing as well. As an editor, he was very good. And I think he was trying to, back in the day, say, hey, look, with this, you can escape and enjoy yourselves. Rather than reading, I think it was more of an outcry against literary fiction rather than saying Sword and Sorcery has no depth. And unfortunately, that's not as clear in reading now that that's what he was really about. Yes, he liked the lighter stuff. He loved Burroughs. I don't know that there's too much political depth with Burroughs, but it's cracking good pacing, right? It sweeps you away into action and adventure, and that's what he loved.
Yeah, no, it's possible maybe I get hung up on some of the sort of, to me, amusing datedness. Like, he literally says, you won't have to think about Spiro Agnew, and I'm like, I wasn't. Yeah, don't worry, man. But, yeah, I just remember that intro really, really caught me, and I was like, oh, it did feel that, at least to me on my first reading without, as I'm still learning about him, it was an odd promise to make, because I don't think you have to work a political issue, like, specifically, like, some sort of, I don't know, vote no on Prop 75 or whatever into your stories, but I think they should always be saying something, whether or not it directly ties to a hot button issue.
Well, they can be saying something about the human condition, even if it's not a hot button issue. Or they can be merely entertaining. But I think good writing can say something about the human condition, even if it's just, I'm putting air quotes, an adventure story.
Yeah, I guess it's this thing where it's not so much I'm trying to sort of shove politics into my Sword and Sorcery, more that I think it's a false choice. I think you can have substance and style, heaven forbid. You can have a story that really says something, as you say, whether it's about something more particular to do with power structures between people, which I feel you get a lot of in the Lankmar stories, or something more about the human condition, which is maybe more, Howard's jam. Okay, so meanwhile, there's an aspect of Sword and Sorcery that I don't think maybe is discussed enough, and I would love for you to share your thoughts on. And now, re-enchanting the world is how I heard it described in that Best of 20th Century panel. Over in the Tales of the Magician's Skull submission guidelines from earlier this year, one thing it was made clear you were looking for was a sense of wonder, not hopelessness, lost cities and gleaming treasure and forgotten lands. In a nutshell, I think there's actually, an incredible positivity in this genre. It's not grimdark. I think there's like an empowering, almost life-affirming feel to the whole thing that I think people are really craving right now while living through this exciting chapter of a history book that we're all enjoying. So please, I'm wondering, could you maybe tell us a bit about how you interpret trying to convey, a sense of wonder, of re-enchanting the world, not hopelessness or any of that stuff, that this genre can bring to the table? Like, how can Sword and Sorcery do that? How does it do that?
Well, I think if you're going for a sense of wonder, first, take me to wonderful places. Take me to amazing vistas that it would take a team of special effects guys a couple of weeks to put together, but that you can describe on an old Underwood typewriter while sitting in your parents' house. That's what I want. I want to be transported. I want to see splendors as well as horrors. I don't just want to see terrible people doing terrible things. I want to see some of that, but I also want to see people overcoming challenges. I want to see scenes of splendor and heroism, and it also depends upon presentation. There's a great line in a minor Harold Lamb story where a man is witnessing someone flying down the face of the mountain. And after you read it, it looks to him like it's magic. But as a modern reader, you realize, wait a second, that guy's on skis. If you put yourself in the position of people from different times and different cultures, some of the things that we take for granted are seen as incredible and are seen as magics. So as always, if you're working on it as a writer, you have to put yourself in the place of the people who were there. And then some of the things that we might take for granted become more wondrous and special.
I think that's a great answer. Thank you. Yeah, it's just one aspect of it that I really like, and has definitely been a big part of why I've dived heavy into sword and sorcery over the last couple of years. I just, it feels downright uplifting. It makes the world feel bigger and more exciting, as much as it's also sometimes largely cosmic and terrifying. If, say, you're reading Tower of the Elephant, and we all know what happens in that story. And for those of you who don't, it's a very short, easily found story online for free. Gutenberg Press.
It's one of the greatest sword and sorcery ones. Tales, and you should read it. Tower of the Elephant. And we should both make clear that while there is some excellent sword and sorcery that is incredibly entertaining, there's, of course, lots of dreck as well. So neither of us are blindly endorsing all sword and sorcery.
Yeah, it's true. I love it to pieces, but like anything, especially anything that had a period where it was very much being written to pay the bills. You can tell sometimes when you're reading a story where someone just needed to make the rent that month, perhaps.
Right. And sometimes there's people who just want to focus on the surface aspects of it. For instance, there's nothing wrong with a big, bright comic book sometimes where it's just two mutants beating the heck out of each other. Though sometimes some sword and sorcery is a little bit like that. I don't know that I'd want a steady diet of that every story I read, but that kind of sword and sorcery is fun too.
Oh yeah, no, as much as I don't want to say make fun, I kind of pull on Lin Carter's pigtails a little bit in terms of his writing, his editing. I should be so lucky, my God, to have that career. But I do that, and yet, I mean, I could, if I wanted to, I kind of wiggle out of it with the Lancer paperbacks. Oh, I'm studying Conan. But I also, nobody put a gun to my head and maybe buy, I've got 4. I'm trying to find the other 2 that remain of his World's End series. The one about the sort of big He-Man, bimbo who's, intellectually 10 years old, and he's an android, and he just pops out of a mountain into this insane pastiche of, many different kinds of worlds and settings, and just has insane adventures with flying cities and giant red women that want him to sleep with them.
It's never been one of my favorites. If you want to read some of them at his best, Lost World of Time, I think most of us consider his very best. And that's a fine, short sword and sorcery novel. If he'd written more like that, I think he'd be more discussed. There's Kellery the Warlock, and doggone, I can't remember what the third one that I really liked is. They have sort of similar sounding vibes, right? But then he also has some excellent short stories. There's one of his Lord Dunsany pastiches that I think is just phenomenal. It's based on the Sword of Welleran, right? He kind of steals the plot beats from the Sword of Welleran, but the story's called Zingazar. Yeah, I know. That's the name of the sword. And it's just marvelous. I think it's a minor masterpiece, and more people ought to read it. That's Lin Carter doing his very best. And this probably sounds like heresy, but Dunsany was a genius. Okay, Lord Dunsany was a genius. This is the one time where I think someone took the plot beats that Lord Dunsany hit and actually wrote a better story.
That's a bold claim.
Really excellent short story.
Cool. All right. So your guy, your serialized protagonist in Tales is Hanivar Cabrera. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. A kind of living legend wandering the earth and fighting for the survivors of his conquered but not vanquished people. I hope that's a fair summary. His story in Tales number 3 was my introduction to your writing, and let me tell you, it got me on board. It worked. More recently, I'm happy to see there'll be a new Hanivar story in the upcoming issue, number 6 of Tales. Now, my question is, as editor, you had the authority to serialize basically whomever you wanted to, I presume. What made you choose Hanivar, and what are your hopes for his future?
That's a complicated question. First off, I'll just go ahead and copy the fact, okay, Hanivar is my secret project that I'm working on. Second, the whole Magician's Skull thing started because Joseph Goodman contacted me, wanted to know if I had a story that he could include in the Goodman Games yearly book that was released at Gen Con. And I said yes. And I gave him the first Hanivar story. And he printed that, and then next year he said, hey, do you have another one? And I said, sure, I can write another one. I've got one in mind. And then a little bit later he says, do you have any other friends who write sword and sorcery? I'm like, of course I do. I'm surrounded by contacts in the industry who love sword and sorcery. And so then a little bit later says, I'm thinking of starting a magazine. And then I jumped up and down and threw my hat in the ring and did as many magic tricks as I could to say, I want to, please let me edit this. So at that point, there was already another Hanavar story in the mix, and I was the editor, and I felt weird about that. We all know, well, those of us who know Lynn Carter know that he always shoved his work into his books. And sometimes he wrote under a pseudonym so that there were two of his short stories in his books. The guy was bold. And I didn't want to come off like that. So Goodman said, look, I really like your writing. I would like to see you continue in the magazine. And so I do appear in the magazine, but I'm not in every issue. So there's that. As far as my hopes for Hanavar, I love writing this character. I don't know that I've had as much fun consistently writing a single character possibly ever, or at least not since I was actually in control of my writing. Maybe when I was 6, I really enjoyed telling stories about my elephant. But yeah, I really want to see Hanavar take off. I'm excited, and I want to do a whole series of books about it, starting with the one I'm nearly done with.
Okay, well, I count me as someone else who wants to see Hanavar take off. So, listeners, buy it. Buy it. Throw money at this man for this book and others. You know, I love how in the story from Tales number 3, which is called The Second Death of Hanavar, and listeners, you can buy physical copies of it. I'll link that in the show notes, or PDFs if you prefer that. But yeah, in that story, The Second Death of Hanavar, it's really all about him not only fighting for others, but helping them fight for themselves. And I really like that. Now, an off-sided detail, or when people try to define this genre that I see, is like, well, they have, you know, you can spot a sword and sorcery hero because he's kind of more mercenary. You know, he or she, you know, they're more interested in money and, you know, just something to put in their pocket, some food, some glory, less so much helping others necessarily. But I feel, you know, Hanavar is absolutely a sword and sorcery hero, and yet here he is very much trying to like help, empower others, empower his lost, conquered people. So I'm assuming the answer is yes, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts at large about it. Can a sword and sorcery hero be all about empowering others, even though that's a very selfless, you know, act?
Oh, absolutely. I think that some of those definitions miss the point. They're focusing in on the wrong elements. I try to be broad with how I define sword and sorcery. As a matter of fact, with the help of a few other people, I wrote the definition that's on the Tales from the Magician's Skull website. I don't happen to have that sitting here, and it's really long. I don't have it memorized word for word, but that'll discuss where I think the borderlines are. Yeah, absolutely. I think there's room for more heroic action.
Okay, so riffing off of what you just said, what have been your experiences as both writer and editor in trying to walk along that sweet spot where you aren't being so dogmatic about what sword and sorcery is that the only thing allowed are pastiches or clones of works by the original masters, but also not going, you know, playing so loose and easy with what qualifies that it just sort of becomes an undefined mess? How do you hew as a writer or editor into like the perfect middle, as it were, or try your best to hit that perfect middle?
Honestly, as an editor, I haven't found it that difficult. We try to be welcoming of people who draw from the old well, based on sound storytelling principles and creating wonder, but aren't trying to just do the same thing, not creating the same characters and putting them in slightly different situations. We're trying to get people who want to tell similar kinds of stories based in the same traditions, but who don't want to tell the exact same story. And I haven't had too much trouble. I mean, the ones that feel too much like they're just a carbon copy aren't the ones that I get excited about and want to accept. Because unfortunately, when people are copying something, they're not copying all of it. They're only seeing one aspect that really appealed to them, and they'll fast on that. And for instance, when I used to read Slush for Black Gate, back when it was a physical magazine, I could tell someone who'd been reading Lovecraft, because they wouldn't necessarily be going for the same kind of cosmic horror. They would be going for his style. And unfortunately, Lovecraft could frequently be turgid.
Yep.
Right, hard to suck down. And the same thing can happen with some of these sword and sorcery stories in a similar way. You'll see some aspect that someone is focused on. That is a natural thing that happens in the process of learning how to find your own voice. Because God knows I used to do that my own self. I'm not denigrating people for doing that. It's part of the process. You've got to experiment and figure out what other people were doing before you can find out how you want to do what you want to do.
Oh, absolutely. A lot of my early short stories that nobody's allowed to see, you know, you can see someone doing a bad imitation of Hunter S. Thompson.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So I haven't found too much of I haven't found any problem with it. And once I found my own voice, I haven't had any trouble finding it as a writer. So, yeah.
Okay. Still hanging on genre a little bit, just a little bit longer here. I'm curious. I listened to your interview from back in, I want to say April or May, spring, with Rogues of the House. Great, lovely podcast, listeners. If you're not familiar, if you like Sword and Sorcery, check it out. And in that interview, near the end, you were saying how your brand new book, which will be linked to in the show notes, everybody check it out. Finishing the Ringsworn trilogy here. I'm curious. You sort of mentioned at the end how it's sort of promoted as epic fantasy, but you kind of had like you could almost hear the sly smile over the podcast, and you were like, well, but really, I took a sword and sorcery story and I put the epic fantasy's boots on it. I'm curious, like, would you still stand by that description? I know it's a few months later, but would you say?
Absolutely. Well, the trick is, so there's problems. Publishers don't want to refer to things as sword and sorcery because there was a backlash against it. For a while there were so many terrible Conan knockoffs and bad sword and sorcery movies that for a long time there, people thought that sword and sorcery meant that you had to have a barbarian in a fur diaper and a damsel in distress who was useless except for looking sexy. And if you describe something as sword and sorcery, they assume that's what your fiction was. And so they began to look for other ways to describe it. And now, of course, the term is so confused. I was just on Reddit earlier today trying to explain the difference between that and high fantasy with a very intelligent person who'd never understood, who'd never read enough to see it. And part of that, it's just gotten muddy. For a long time, role-playing games have been described as sword and sorcery. Well, kind of, but then people get used to seeing like game fiction and gaming referred to as sword and sorcery, and they think that that means that it has an elf and a wizard and a hobbit in it, and that means it's sword and sorcery. It's so confusing. Anyway, if you follow how I define sword and sorcery, then I think that my Ringsworn trilogy is sword and sorcery, albeit it has much more of a Roger Zelazny feel than it has a Robert Howard feel, where you've got these superpowered characters who are interacting and they're uncovering intrigue about the way the world works, and there's plots and counterplots and all kinds of sword play that's different from the more typical Howardian sword play, which I do love. I'm just saying that there's a slightly different feel to the Zelazny sword play. So yes, I definitely stand by this being sword and sorcery, albeit it's another distinct flavor of sword and sorcery rather than some that you assume it is. There you go.
Okay, so a name you mentioned a few times there in your answer was Zelazny. I have been doing this podcast from the point of view that people who are listening maybe are coming in cold. And I've mentioned, Howard and Leiber and Moorcock and other names quite a few times, but I've never mentioned Zelazny, and I know he's very important to you. Would you mind sort of just telling our listeners a little bit about why they might want to check him out and what he means to you?
Sure. Well, Zelazny and Leiber were the first true fantasy writers that I ever read. You could count The Hobbit because my mom read it to me when I was 6, but let's not, because that was more I imbibed it along with a whole bunch of other stuff. This I actively sought out. I got the appendix in back of Dungeon Master's Guide, and I went to the library and the used bookstore and the bookstore, and I tried to find these books. And I found Leiber's Swords Against Death, which was I still think is the best of all the Lankhmar collections. And then friends were reading the Chronicles of Amber. And this must have been around 77, 78, and I believe they were all out at that point. And my God, it blew the doors off my imagination. It starts simply enough with a man waking up in a hospital bed under sedation and not knowing exactly who he is, but realizing maybe he's not here under his own willpower, and maybe he ought to get out. Well, we soon find out that he's Corwin of Amber, the one true city, the one from the one true world. All other realities are shadows cast by Amber. So it's this whole parallel world thing. He's this mighty individual, but he has these scheming brothers and sisters. And he goes out trying first to recover his memory and figure out what's going on. And then pretty soon it seems like it's going to be a revenge story to find the brothers and sisters who prune onto our Earth, which is just a shadow. But then pretty soon it becomes much more than a simple tale of vengeance, because there's also the kingdom's threatened. People get framed for things maybe they didn't commit. There's a traitor somewhere out there. It just spins all these wonderful threads. And the more you understand about the world and come to care about it, the more realize that their own understanding of the world isn't even fully formed, that there's secrets within secrets within secrets. It's just delightful. And it's all All the books were short. Remember, this was in it could be that the earliest one was written in the very late 60s, but they were all done by the 70s. So we're talking much shorter novels, talking no more than 40 to 70,000 words a piece, probably more like 60. You could probably collect all 5 of the original books in one book the size of Wheel of Time. Maybe it's shorter than one volume of Wheel of Time. It tells so much more story. It's so satisfying. It pulls you forward. It has this it alternates between gumshoe prose and just this lyrical word punch. It's usually sold now as the Big Book of Amber. And some years after the first 5 novels, he came back in with 5 more. The majority of Amber fans would probably tell you the 5 sequel novels are inferior. They're not narrated by Corwin. Some people still get a charge out of them. I was disappointed. Just a heads up that really the thing that delighted me were those first 5.
Well, yeah, no, you teach their own. I'm curious, how would you say Zelazny and that series impacted your own writing?
Well, Amber itself had a huge impact. It especially influenced this particular series, just as Harold Land sort of had an impact. I loved this. So these immortal Amberites have almost superhuman. Well, they are superhuman abilities because they're sort of like perfect humans, right? And we're all inferior shadows of them. So they're long-lived, pretty much immortal, although they can be killed. Super strong, super quick, incredible healing, all these amazing things. But I loved the astonishingly bizarre world building and the layers and layers of intrigue. And so you will see those elements in the Ringsworn trilogy. You will see characters, they're not quite as superhuman as Amberites are, but they are an elite core of warriors who've trained and they do amazing things. Some of them have mastered sorcery. There's all kinds of weird world building. There are secrets about the way the world works, and there's people with hidden agendas that come out over the course of the novel. So I loved those particular things from Amber, and I wanted to do similar things to give the same kind of delight that I felt upon reading this. I was trying to create that same kind of delight in readers when they came to this one.
Well, I like that because, I mean, isn't that just the truth of the matter? You want to try and make, when you're writing, other people feel the same joys that you felt when you read the stuff that inspired you. I think that's really great.
Absolutely.
So as I mentioned before, I did really enjoy your heroic fantasy writing course. I'm just wondering, do you plan on teaching that class again, or maybe teaching other classes?
Yes, I've just signed on to teach it for, I guess it's the upcoming fall session. And I believe I signed up for November, some Saturday in mid-November. And I have given thought to teaching some other courses, but it takes a while to put coursework together and design a course. And right now I'm in the middle of working on Skull Promotions and promoting book 3 of the trilogy that just came out. And I'm also working really hard to finish this Conovar novel. And the thought of trying to design another course or two, I know my head would explode.
Yeah, fair enough. If people are interested in taking your heroic fantasy writing course, which I'll say right now I recommend, I loved it, how would they find out? You know, I got lucky. I think I saw a Goodman Games post about your class. I just got in there before it filled up, which was like the same day, I believe. You know, if people want to keep an eye out and be able to get in under the wire, how would they best do that?
Well, they can go to themuse.org. It's not through Goodman Games, and it's not through me. It's by a wonderful organization on the East Coast. Offers all sorts of online courses as well as some in-person courses. I do not teach in person since I do not live on the East Coast.
Well, that's okay. It worked out. I mean, I'm in Toronto and I got to take your course, so no complaints. You know, I know a lot of people have kind of Zoom exhaustion, but taking that class was not the same thing as having a meeting with your boss and 5 coworkers. Okay, cool. I'm glad you're going to be doing more. I selfishly, I would say I would love to have a class where you deconstruct the prose of Liber. You know, I feel like there's a lot of stuff out there on, like, you know, Howard's muscular adverbs and so forth, and great. But I don't see quite as much about the actual, like, sentence construction almost of Liber. I've seen some plenty on his themes and use of character, but yeah, he's someone that's really on my mind right now because he's definitely, his Langmore stories are, you know, definitely the primary influence on the stories I'm getting into. I'm getting into sort of the second act of my book, and I want to have a City of Thieves and some things like that, and I'm thinking of Langmore. And I know my weakness, I've mentioned before in the show, is kind of also my strength. I mean, I'm impatient, which I feel is almost a strength because it means, like, you know, if I want to write something, I just freaking do it, but it also makes it harder for me to focus on, like, following the, you know, the specifics of the mechanics of the prose as opposed to, say, the character and plot and theme, which I feel like I'm pretty good at picking up on.
That's something to fix in revision, though, right? You get it all down, and then you come back and you add in those other details. That's nothing to slow you down. Impatience is a virtue when you're writing sword and sorcery.
I'm gonna put that on my wall or above my computer because that's good. Patience is a virtue when writing sword and sorcery. That's like, oh, thank you. So something else actually that came up in the course, and I believe you've said this elsewhere. You know, you described sword and sorcery often in cinematic terms. You did it earlier in this interview, I believe. Usually regarding, say, camera moves as metaphor for the focus of the prose, right? In the class we talked about, like, you know, starting in the tight focus lens or you know, zooming out to like a master shot, that kind of thing. With the bias of my mainly being a screenwriter, I completely agree with seeing it through this lens. But man, you know, I'm wondering, like, given it is just so cinematic, just as obviously this is an opinion, I don't expect an empirical truth here, but I'm wondering, you know, why the heck aren't there more than like one or two good sword and sorcery films? You know, what do you think is going on there? Why don't we have more great adaptations? Why are we still going back to 1982 Conan, which is great, but man, you know, it was 39 years ago.
Well, I don't know what to tell you, except that so often the wrong people get involved in making them. They insisted on having an origin story when they tried to do the Solomon Kane. They insisted on having an origin story when they tried to reboot Conan, and it's the people who get involved in it don't understand the source material. The source material isn't about origin stories. It's not, we're going to follow this epic fantasy character from when he's born on up to get his background. No, it's an old-style story where the detective walks onto the screen, your hard-boiled detective walks on screen, and we know all we need to know about him by seeing him in action. That's the way sword and sorcery needs to be handled, because it is hard-boiled. It was born from the same time period, has a lot of the same sound, honestly. So it's not film. The people who come to put it on the screen think that they're going to film a fantasy story. But what they're really doing is they need to be thinking about a hard-boiled story and approach it that way. The character's fully formed. There may be a character arc, but it's not a journey where the character is coming into his own or his own power. The character's got that power right from the start. And the audience really doesn't need to give a crap about that, because that's not what it's about.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. And you know, the seductive pull of the origin story, eh? I mean, think about how many times we've been told, you know, Batman or Spider-Man's origin story in the last 20 years, or even like to come back to the library, you know, I think about how there's definitely pleasures to be had in the individual origin stories that he like later wrote when he decided he wanted to knit all of his short stories into a grand narrative. The individual origins for Fafhrd and then Grey Mouser. But I don't think you would find any fans of those guys who wouldn't tell you that really it gets started with Ilmet and Lankmar, the chronological third story where the two guys meet, because that's where the story starts.
I'm not even as big a fan of that one as I am some of the earlier stuff. But yeah, the two that are written about their backgrounds, you know, a lot of people tell me that they stop after the first novel, that they weren't that impressed. I'm like, yeah, I get it. I'm so lucky that the used bookstore only had book 2. Because I was enraptured. Now, maybe I would have kept reading if I started with book 1 anyway, because I was 13, 14, and I read a lot more and I was more patient. If I didn't enjoy something all the way, sometimes I thought maybe I wasn't clever enough to get it. I wasn't critical enough to stop. But yeah, the origin isn't really that necessary. And he, of course, was being paid to create more Lankmar content, and so he did.
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, if it's where the story starts, fair enough, right? Like, I really enjoy Elric of Melniboné, which was written later, right? It was chronologically set at the beginning, but not the actual first story that Moorcock wrote of Elric. But that's because, like, stuff happens, you know? And it builds his character and sets him up. It's not just like, well, this was his mom and somebody was bullying him anyway, you know? Leap forward 10 years, his village gets raided, and now we're off to the races. Yeah, it's that thing of, I guess, it's one of the oldest pieces of writing advice, but it always holds true. Start the story where it starts. And so, listener, if you're coming into this still kind of fresh to sword and sorcery, and you're thinking, I'm so tired of origin stories being told over and over in these superhero movies that I like, check it out, man. It's a good genre for getting around that.
I will say that actually the Elric novel that he went back and did, the origin story, I actually quite like that. I think that may be one of the best of the Elric novels. So I have a different feeling about the first Elric that he did later as opposed to the first Fafhrd and Grey Mouser. I want to make clear I'm not advocating, never go back and do an origin story, but only do it if it's going to work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like it felt like with the Elric one, it sets up the world in ways that are necessary, and it also really helps you better understand him as he moves forward. So whereas the Fafhrd and Grey Mouser origin stories, I found especially Grey Mousers, which was I was just reading. I was doing a little bit of scholarship up at the Merrill Collection. I've mentioned a few times. There's this archive in Toronto. I was reading Fafford and Me, right, the 1990 book of essays, and he talks about how the Grey Mouser origin story, the Unholy Grail, was originally another story just written about some guy.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And then, a friend of his was like, why don't you change the title to something a bit cooler? I forget the original title, it wasn't great. And make it Grey Mouser and just add in some mentionings of Lankmar being on the horizon. And so, that also may have played a role. But there you go, right? The origin didn't come from a place of necessity. It came from a place of I think I need one,
I think Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, trying to have a story of them individually is also like listening to the Beatles after they break up. They're greater than the sum of their parts. You get all four of the Beatles together and it's magical. Now, separate, they can still do some good things, but it's never as awesome. They're greater than some of the parts. Well, Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser are the same way. They're far more interesting together than they are apart. They're entertaining in that one story where they're still in the same story, but they're going in slightly different directions. Lean Times and Lankmar.
That's the funniest one, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's one of the funniest sword and sorcery stories I've written. But yeah, they're both still in the story and interacting with each other. In those origin stories, they're not interacting with each other.
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly not breaking new ground by saying this, but those guys work by being struck off each other like a pair of flints. If they're completely actually separate as opposed to just on either half of the same story, it doesn't work. Yeah. So there you go, right? I mean, the origin has to be of the essence of everything that comes after, and if it's not, then maybe that's the rule. I don't know. By the way, if I can just be cheeky for a second, I know you guys, Tales, have the rights for Fafhrd and Grey Mouser, and are going to have a new story in issue 6 and more to come, I'm sure. Do y'all have the film and TV rights?
No.
And do you need a screenwriter? Okay, no, shoot. All right. Well, I was going to shoot my shot there, but all right.
That would be fabulous, but you wouldn't want to hook up to get any screen rights from me because I don't even own a camera anymore.
Okay, well, because I was just thinking, oh man, I would watch the hell out of that show, and I mean, a movie would be good too, but I would just love to see the serialized, or episodic adventures of those guys charging around.
I'm surprised so much hasn't happened. I think that we may finally be seeing some Corwin come to the small screen. Conan. I think we're finally going to see some Conan. I can't believe we've never seen Chronicles of Amber in all those years. We've never seen 3 movies made off of it or a TV series. And I can't believe that Elric. I can't believe that Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser. Jarell of Joiry. There's all.
I would love to see her.
Cool characters that we haven't seen that someone could do with. How about Amaro?
Actually, I think this might have been on the Rogues in the House podcast. I believe they mentioned at some point they had heard something about an Amaro series in the works, and that some of the casting's actually been happening, and it's more serious than just the discussions are being had. The architecture is being put into place. So fingers crossed that that's true.
He's much more of a heroic character in his stories. We were talking about it earlier. Well, he's someone who most of the famous sword and sorcery heroes you would not want to sit down to do. Amaro was a genuinely good guy. You could just feel for him. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he's always trying to find community, and it never really works out for too long. And so you can't help but feel bad for him, yeah. And so as we go in here, I've got last question, kind of a two-parter. I'm wondering, could you, as sort of recommendation to our listeners here, could you please choose one sword and sorcery, or adjacent to sword and sorcery, author that you think the public at large need to be reading more? I'm guessing you're going to say Leigh Brackett or Harold Lamb, but I'm open to any answer. Who's somebody that doesn't get mentioned enough that people should check out?
Well, there's no one good answer. People think they know Conan, but they haven't really read Robert E. Howard. So, yes, read some Robert E. Howard. Read some Harold Lamb. There's another person whose work could be turned into a wonderful miniseries. The swashbuckling Cossack stories of Harold Lamb are just delightful. I say they're old and they are old. I guess all of these stories. But they're so cinematic. They're written in 1917 and they are not dull at all. They just thunder forward. He was impatient. It was that impatience is a virtue. And, of course, Leigh Brackett had wonderful lyrical prose. I think it can be harder for people to get into Leigh Brackett because she wrote of a Venus that isn't the nasty sulfuric planet that we know, but the Venus that had dinosaurs and swamps, and her Mars is this dying planet that has civilizations on it. It's not a dead planet; it's just a dying one. It still has civilizations and oxygen and all these wonders. And so people have a hard time. It's like, oh, well, that's not real. Well, none of it's real, right?
Yeah.
It's all imaginary. Let's just imagine Mars is like that. Let's just imagine Venus. She wrote wonderful tales set there. And, of course, the only other problem with Brackett is that she has very few recurring characters. There's really only about 4 Stark stories that aren't part of her novel sequence. And one of them is kind of a throwaway she wrote with her husband. So there's really only 3 Eric John Stark stories apart from the novels. The Eric John Stark stories, I think, are marvelous. But yeah, she might be harder to get because almost each one has to stand alone. Although the Mars seems like it's the same Mars, and then Venus seems like it's the same Venus. Like she goes to the same place with different people.
Well, fair enough. I mean, the story you had us read for the class really grabbed me, and to the thing of it being not realistic, Mars, quote unquote, Mars or Venus. I think I'm not sure if hard sci-fi fanatics are quite as fanatical these days. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they're going to come for me on Twitter. And also, if anybody's listening, thinking, oh yeah, I don't know if it's Venus with dinosaurs, it sounds kind of kooky. Well, you probably enjoyed The Empire Strikes Back, and Lee Brackett only wrote the first draft of the screenplay for that. So, and that was hardly hard science. And so yeah, the other half of this, my last question for you, on the other end of the equation, looking forward, or maybe very much to the present, could you choose, I know there'll be too many names to choose from, you might feel bad trying to choose one person, so just like first thing that bubbles up in your brain, could you choose a brand new baby sword and sorcerer, or sword and sorcery or sword and sorcery adjacent author that you'd like us all to check out? Somebody's pretty fresh that you think more people need to be reading.
Oh, I think you need to read the authors from Tales from the Magician's Skull.
That's true.
I think you need to look at a list of those guys, and gals. If I used guys in a neutral sense, right?
I gotcha.
I think that I dare not say just one because I'd be leaving all kinds of people behind. So go read that. You'll find Nathan Long and Chris Hawking and Sarah Newton, Violet Milan, Chris Wilrich, and Jim Zing, and my God, see, I'm already beginning to leave people off who I don't want to leave off. Clint Warner. I could go on and on and on. Read the frickin' magazine. I love these short stories. I spend an awful lot of time pulling them together and making sure that they get into print. Joseph Goodman has done an amazing job with his team and getting it and promoting it. The vision he has for this thing. I'm just so delighted to be working with him.
Yeah, no, it must be a dream, man, because not only is everything I've ever heard about working with Joseph Goodman been extremely positive, but it's this thing of sword and sorcery. I like to think it's reinflating in a way. It's getting bigger and bigger. It's looking more and more in the sense of there being more markets and more readers and more authors, which is so nice to see after the sort of deflating in the 80s and 90s. But then you look back to the Golden Age and the Silver Age and these wonderful magazines, and it feels like you are successfully evoking the Weird Tales and all that good stuff, all the things where it really began with Tales from Magician's Skull. And I as someone who loves reading the old stuff and is the good fortune to live near a special archive where I can look at original copies of those old classic pulps, it's so fun to be reading Tales and going, yeah, they're nailing it, man. This has both the excitement of the new and the evocation of the Golden Age.
That's Joseph's vision, and that's also the skill of the layout genius, Lester Portland. It's just he's pretty amazing.
Yeah, and I know Joseph Goodman brings to it the high quality materials. I remember I picked it up. I was like, holy crap, this is like a proper book that just is in the shape of a magazine. It's really good paper, which sounds a goofy thing to say, but most magazines today, not so much.
Well, that paper has been a blessing and a curse because it's been really hard to get hold of COVID.
Oh.
The last 2 issues have been delayed, not because we didn't have things ready to go, but because we couldn't lay hold of the paper that we used for the first 4 issues. So 5 was running a little late. I believe 6 is now at least a month and a half late. And again, we had everything on our end. We just couldn't lay hold of the paper. We did not want to publish, after having such high quality paper, we did not want to publish it on cheaper quality paper, so we had to wait.
The curse of high standards. You guys should have been sloppy, and then you could just done whatever, You should have made a mediocre magazine. It would have been great. Wait, no, actually, by definition, it would have been bad. Anyway, I could talk to you for hours and get lost in far more esoteric questions that would probably lose some of our more casual fan. I should wrap it up. We've gone over an hour anyway. My editor, who's me, will yell at me later for having to edit so much. Thank you so much for joining us. And of course, I've got to give you a chance here. Like I said, I'm going to link the bejesus out of all your stuff on Twitter and on the show notes for the episode. But just to really hammer into people's brains, could you please tell the people where can they find Howard Andrew Jones and what's your new book called again?
My new book is called When the Goddess Wakes. But if you start there on the trilogy, you're going to be about as lost as if you started on Return of the King. The trilogy starts with the novel The Killing of Kings. The second one is Upon the Flight of the Queen, and the third one is When the Goddess Wakes. And they are all now available. You don't have to wait for any more to come out. That is it. Everything's wrapped up. Everyone who lives is going to live. Everyone who dies is already dead. You'll find out. And I really hope you'll give it a try. I had an awful lot of fun reading it. A lot of critics think that it's pretty cool. Even some of my family like it. So.
Oh, that reminds me. Didn't you have a son that did the maps for books 2 and 3?
Yes, my very talented son did do those. I asked if he could do the maps, and they said, "Well, let's see him." And I showed him the maps, and like, yes, he can do the maps. He just graduated a year or two ago. He's making a living now as a graphic artist.
Awesome. And if people just want to like kind of find you online, I know you're not big on Twitter, but you are on there, right?
Yeah, I am on there. I've never really figured out how it works. That sounds silly, I know, but I go on there and try to communicate to Twitter, and I feel like I'm shouting into a void. Anyway, so Twitter, I'm at Howard Andrew John because I couldn't get Jones. Howard Andrew. I'm on Facebook much more often. If you could just search for Howard Andrew Jones for that, and it'll pop up. And of course, my website's at howardandrewjones.com, which I update every now and then. It has pictures of my books and all sorts of writing advice.
Great, thank you, Howard. So yeah, again, I will link to all those in the show notes, guys. You can find that quick and easy, or you can just Google Howard's name, as you say. You will find him. Yeah, again, thank you so much for joining me, Howard. This was a lot of fun.
Well, I've had a real blast. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
And that was Howard Andrew Jones. All right. Join us next week when we're going to be doing the episode that would have gone up today, but then I got the opportunity to talk to Howard, so, you don't sleep on that. Next week will be research and how I go about it, followed by getting into new stories, the outlining of the new stories, following the first one that birthed this whole project. So, I'm writing a novel, features original music by Gloria Guns, and is hosted by yours truly, Oliver Brackenbury. If you'd like to submit a question, then please email it to soimwritinganovel@gmail.com. Bonus points if you record yourself and send me an MP3 I can cut into the show. Doesn't have to be fancy, using your phone is fine, just keep it clear and concise. You can also holler at the show on Twitter. Look for @so_writing. Please consider sharing the show with anybody who might like it, leaving a review on iTunes, and checking out patreon.com/soimwritinganovel. Patrons get to be thanked in the final novel, listen to episodes of the podcast a week early, and even enjoy a bonus podcast called So I Wrote a Novel, where I read and comment on chapters of previous works, starting with my first novel, Junkyard Leopard. Thanks for hanging out with me and Howard, and I'll see you soon.